Hi, my name is Andrew Evans, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about the concepts of neurodiversity and also the social model of disability. The way I conceive of these concepts and the way I'm going to approach it here in this video is as critiques of how we normally think about illness and healthcare. So normally I talk about mental health care, and that's what I've talked about in past videos. And this is relevant to mental health care, but goes a bit beyond that and really is about healthcare in general. But I'm not an expert on either of these topics, so I will be relying on ideas from different authors, one of which is Nick Walker, and I will be referring to her 2013 piece, Throw Away the Master's Tools. Also, I will be relying on Leonard Davis's 1997 piece, Constructing Normalcy, and Sarah Gearing's 2015 piece, Rethinking Disability, the Social Model of Disability and Chronic Disease. Okay, so what I want to start with, though, is what do we normally mean when we say illness, disease, or disorder? And similarly, what is the purpose of healthcare? What is the goal of medicine? So this is a topic I've discussed in a lot of other videos, especially relating to mental health care. So I'm going to just briefly touch on it here. So I think in the traditional sense, here are some approaches that have had some influence. These are some different concepts of illness. Thomas Saz says that an illness is a deviation from a norm characterized by the structural or functional integrity of the body. So that means that illness is some bodily dysfunction. Kendall says that an illness has to do with an increase in mortality or decrease in fertility. So if an illness makes it more likely that you'll die or less likely that you'll reproduce, then, or if a condition does, then that makes it an illness. And Wakefield has this harmful dysfunction analysis where he thinks there needs to be an evolutionary dysfunction that's also harmful. These aren't the only concepts of illness or disorder that are out there, but I think they do represent this more traditional view that illness implies something has gone wrong, right? They're all grounded in some sort of idea of something not meeting some norm or standard. Um, so I kind of take this as our normal approach, thinking about illness as something has gone wrong, and thinking about healthcare as being a field that treats or even cures illnesses or disorders or disabilities, right? So we can kind of think of this as the traditional view. But the two approaches that I'm going to be talking about this video, neurodiversity and the social model of disability, I think challenge that traditional view. So we're going to start with neurodiversity, and we can ask, what is neurodiversity? And here I'm going to rely on Walker's piece, Throw Away the Master's Tools, Liberating Ourselves from the Pathology Paradigm. And here she says, quote, "This piece was originally written for an autistic audience, so it's specifically addressed to autistic readers and focused on what the shift from the pathology paradigm to the neurodiversity paradigm means in the context of the discourse on autism. Nonetheless, it serves as a good 101 level introduction to the neurodiversity paradigm for anyone." And you can find this piece online. I think I agree with Walker that it really does serve as a nice introduction to neurodiversity. And so I'm going to rely on her thinking around neurodiversity in order to discuss it here. And really, the main distinction that she makes is between this pathology paradigm and the neurodiversity paradigm. The pathology paradigm, and these are Walker's words here, she says, the pathology paradigm says, one, there is one right, normal, or healthy way for human brains and human minds to be configured and to function, or one relatively narrow normal range into which the configuration and functioning of human brains and minds ought to fall. So this first point here is saying, in terms of our minds and our brains, there's one or some narrow set of ways that it's normal to be. So here, Walker is referring to mental conditions in brain conditions, specifically because she's mostly interested in autism here. The second point is if your neurological configuration and functioning, and as a result, your ways of thinking and behaving diverge substantially from the dominant standard of the quote normal, there is something wrong with you, right? So here, the second point is that if you diverge from this norm, then something has gone wrong. So the pathology paradigm, in a lot of ways, I think represents this traditional view that I introduced earlier in the video. Walker contrasts that with what she calls the neurodiversity paradigm. And here there are 3 points. The first point says that neurodiversity, which is the diversity among minds, is a natural, healthy, and valuable form of human diversity. 2, there is no quote normal or quote right style of the human mind any more than there is one quote normal or quote right ethnicity, gender, or culture. 3, the social dynamics that manifest in regard to neurodiversity are similar to the social dynamics that manifest in regard to other forms of human diversity. These dynamics include the dynamics of social power relations, as well as the dynamics by which diversity, when embraced, acts as a source of creative potential within a group or society. So this is an alternative to the pathology paradigm. The idea here is that neurodiversity, right, minds, differences between different people's minds, is something that's normal and healthy and is valuable, right? That we have this sort of diversity and that can be compared to other forms of human diversity, like ethnicity, gender, or culture. And then this last point is that there are social dynamics and power dynamics around neurodiversity, just as there is around other forms of diversity, but also that it can be a source of happiness for people, it can be a source of creative potential within a group, right? So let's apply this to an example. What would it mean to take a pathology paradigm approach versus a neurodiversity paradigm approach to a particular person? So suppose this person has obsessions and compulsions, right? This person is feeling anxious a lot of the time. They're getting obsessed with certain things, and then they feel compelled to behave in particular ways, right? We might say that this person, especially under a certain paradigm, we might say that this person has obsessive compulsive disorder. And that's what the pathology paradigm would say, right? This person has a disorder. This is a deviation from the normal way that a mind should work. And so it ought to be fixed, right? There's something wrong going on here, and medicine should intervene to help. The neurodiversity paradigm, though, might just say this is a form of human difference, right? This mind works differently than a lot of other minds. But it could be that this person gets a lot of joy or value out of the way her mind works, and that we shouldn't necessarily intervene to change this person's mind just because it's different. It's simply different in the way that we're different in lots of other ways. Okay, so the neurodiversity paradigm is specific to thinking about the brain or the mind. So it's specific more to mental health care, to cognitive disabilities, to autism is, the place that Walker is mostly speaking from. The social model of disability is more general and it applies more to healthcare in general. So what is the social model? Well, the social model, similarly to the way Walker distinguishes between the pathology paradigm and the neurodiversity paradigm, we can also distinguish between the social model and the medical model of disability. So here, Sarah Goering says, quote, "A standard medical approach, indeed a common layperson's approach to thinking about disability, involves viewing it as a problem that exists in a person's body. As a consequence, that individual is thought to require treatment or care to fix the disability, to approximate normal functioning, or perhaps as a last measure, to help the individual adapt and learn to function despite the disability." So that's the medical model, right? The social model, in contrast, is a response, right? It's a critique of the medical model. The social model, quote, relies on a relatively sharp distinction between impairment and disability. So, what do these two terms mean? Here, impairment just means some state of the body. So, an example we might give is the absence of a limb, or we might say a limb that, functions to a lesser extent than it used to, or something like that. Or maybe some mechanism in the body is not functioning the way it was before, or you know, things of that nature, right? But these things aren't necessarily evaluated negatively, right? It's just a state of the body that can be viewed negatively, but it also could be viewed neutrally or even positively, right? So there's something sort of neutral about the idea of an impairment. It's simply a state of the body. And an example we might give is the absence of a limb. Disability, in contrast, includes the disadvantages that are the result of social institutions not taking account of people with impairments. So the social model says people have impairments, but the real challenge is often that society isn't taking into account and making accommodations for people with impairments. So that results in certain disadvantages, that results in certain harms, and that is what they call disability. So similarly, we can apply this to an example. So suppose this person, that uses a wheelchair. Let's try to take either a social model of this person's disability versus a medical model of this person's disability. Under the medical model, we might say that this individual, that there is something wrong, something's gone wrong with this person's body, in that either their legs don't function anymore, or maybe they've lost a limb, or it looks like maybe in this example, this person might be missing a foot. Um, the medical model would take that approach, right? It would say that there's something here that needs to be fixed, quote unquote, or cured, quote unquote. The social model instead would recognize this person has an impairment, maybe their legs, they're not able to use their legs, or maybe they're missing a foot. That's an impairment, but it's only a disability because of society not being built in a way that this person can thrive, right? That would be taking a social model approach rather than a medical model approach. So how can we compare these two approaches? Really, what's interesting about both the neurodiversity paradigm and the social model is that they challenge the way we think about illness and disability. Um, Both the pathology paradigm and the medical model conform to how we normally think about things. Medicine is here to help people go from a state of illness or disability to a state of being healthy or not having a disability. But the social model and the concept of neurodiversity think that having a condition is somewhat neutral. And so there's not always a need to push for some cure or some intervention. Instead, these approaches critique the way society has been set up, noting that it has been built for people who better conform to the norm, right? So here, norms end up being relevant. And this is something I've discussed in other videos. When we're talking about illness and disorder and disease, norms are always relevant. And you can see this in these examples of illness that we talked about here at the beginning. Each of these thinkers is thinking about illness as being some deviation from some norm. For Saz, it's the structural or functional integrity of the body. For Kendall, it's norms in terms of mortality and fertility. For Wakefield, it's in terms of evolutionary functioning, right? When we talk about illness or disease or disability or disorder, we're often talking about deviations from norms. So we can ask, where does that come from, right? What is the significance of norms? In his chapter, Constructing Normalcy, Leonard Davis talks about how the idea of what is normal has changed over time. He explains that centuries ago, rather than the term norm, there was this concept of the ideal. And here, the ideal can be understood as a state of perfection. And that's something that humans were actually never expected to achieve. So before we had this concept of norm, Davis says we had this concept of ideal. and ideal was something maybe only the gods could achieve or something like that. Eventually, this shifted to the idea of a norm or an average. So instead of aiming for perfection, people started to just aim for being like everyone else. So rather than this unachievable ideal, the idea is you just want to be, quote, normal, right? You want to be like everyone else. Here, Davis says, quote, with such thinking, the average then becomes paradoxically a kind of ideal, a position devoutly to be wished. So what he's saying is, being average or being normal or being just like everyone else sort of became the ideal, right? So once we shift this idea of what is good is what is average, it follows that what's outside the average, what's outside the norm is undesirable. So he says, quote, so, with the concept of the norm comes the concept of deviations or extremes. When we think of bodies in a society where the concept of the norm is operative, then people with disabilities will be thought of as deviants. This, as we have seen, is in contrast to societies with the concept of an ideal in which all people have a non ideal status. So, what's interesting here is he says, with this shift to the norm being what's desirable, there are people in society that are abnormal, right? That fall outside of what is standard. But in societies where the ideal was what was desirable, no one could really achieve it, right? So the basic state of being a human is to be non-ideal, right? So he thinks that this, historical account is how we get this idea of norms, where a lot of our ideas of illness and disease and disability end up coming from. And he often refers to the bell curve. This is like a standard statistical thing that shows, with a lot of traits, they fall along this curve. So at the top and in the middle here, you see most of the population, but then on either side, you have people that deviate from that norm. Okay, so in this video, I discussed two models or two concepts that really challenge the way we think about um, medicine, way we think about illness, and really challenge this idea of the norm that Davis brought in here, or at least discussed in terms of the historical construct of it. So these two approaches say, in contrast, that just because something is different from what's average, that does not mean it's undesirable. And it does not mean it should necessarily be altered, right? So why do we want to be just like everyone else? Why do we want to be average? Why is abnormal undesirable? These approaches say it's not undesirable. And we should think about abnormality as difference rather than something that is undesirable. So I'll end with just these questions. What do you think of this conclusion? Do you think that the concept of neurodiversity and the social model of disability have it right? What changes would have to be made to society in order to embrace these approaches? All right, well, that is all I have for this video. Thank you for watching.